Freddy's back. The Nightmares on Elm Street. Freddy Krueger's 7 Sweetest Dreams. Briefcase Full of Blues by Tom Elliott. Trade you for a Raphael? It was September and Louis Dahlgreen was new in the school. So far, Bobby Germain was his only friend. Probably because neither of them was allowed to participate in any sort of physical activity. In the unforgiving hierarchy of the playground, this made them the school's pariahs. Bobby was small for his age, but sturdy enough. It was just that whenever he got excited, his asthma would contract his throat to the point of strangulation. The taller of the pair, Louis, looked more the part, thin, delicately featured, and he had a congenital heart defect. Once he'd tried out the neighbor's monkey bars, and his dad had gotten that look in his eyes, the one that still had the power to scare Louis. Thank God he rarely got that look anymore. Louis examined the plastic action figure in Bobby's extended palm for a moment, then shook his head. Nah, I got a couple already. Just then one of the older boys ran by, chasing an errant ball. Queer boys, he shouted at them. Roberta and Louise. Louis started to shout something back at the boy, but Bobby began shooting blasts of medicine from his inhaler between gasps for air. It was several panicked moments before the inhaler did its stuff. What a jerk, Louis said. He hated being called Louise, so naturally that was the name the older boys picked for him. He wished he looked more solid, more muscular like Bobby. Well, maybe a little taller, and he wouldn't like to have to deal with asthma attacks all the time. What a jerk, Louis repeated. Bobby shrugged. Screw him. They stood a minute in silence, then Bobby dug into his pocket again. When it emerged, it held a rather thick pen, which he placed next to the Michelangelo. Neat, Louis said, leaning closer. On the side of the pen were printed the words, Weaving the threads of imagination for over 40 years. And below that, Springwood Linen Works. Bobby wasn't ready to give up. Both for a Raphael? Louis considered the offer. The 2 sixth graders were standing in the farthest corner of the playground, exactly opposite the red brick schoolhouse that squatted like some sterile old broody hen, each dirty brick set firmly and resolutely upon another. Between the 2 boys and the school, a particularly energetic game of war ball was in session. The shouts of the other kids sounded tiny, as if broadcast from a distant and very cheap radio. Louis shook his head. I already got enough pins. Not like this one. Bobby peered through the pen as if it were a tiny telescope, then lowered it. You look through the end, he explained unnecessarily, then rolled his eyes in a child's broad simulation of ecstasy. It'll knock you out, man. What's in there? Look for yourself. Louis took the pen and examined it carefully. At one end was a thick, oily lens. For a moment, Louis wondered about the wisdom of putting something so dirty-looking near his eye. But then, with a 12-year-old's world-weary shrug, he raised it and peered inside. A miniature woman stood there motionless. She seemed to be staring at him. Now what? Bobby chuckled, his tongue impatiently. You gotta twist it while you're looking in it. Louis complied, and inside the pen, the woman's hand slowly lifted to the top of her blouse. The realism of the motion startled Louis, and he hesitated. Where'd you get this? Bobby shrugged indifferently. My dad's briefcase. You stole it? Yeah. Won't you get in Dutch when your dad finds out? Nah, he had a whole briefcase full of them. Oh, okay. Louis held up the pen again and twisted. Inside, the woman obediently unbuttoned her blouse, lowering her head and peering at Louis from below heavily made-up lids. When she had undone the last button, she turned her back to him and let one shoulder of the blouse slide seductively down her pale arm. She looked back over her shoulder as if checking Louis's reaction. Louis wasn't sure how he was supposed to react. The sight of the woman disrobing gave him a vacant, unpleasant feeling in the pit of his stomach. But he didn't think that was what Bobby expected. Wow, he said finally. Yeah, man, Bobby agreed. So you want to trade? He punctuated the question with a squirt from his inhaler. Huh? For a moment, Lewis had forgotten that this was a business deal. He considered the trade. The pen was obviously more valuable than a couple of plastic turtles. Still, he wasn't all that sure he wanted to look in the pen again. Sure, he said. He dug the Raphael out of his pants pocket and handed it over. Just then the bell rang, and they headed for their respective classrooms. Almost against his will, Lewis found himself raising the pen to his eye and twisting the body as he walked. He lowered the pen just long enough to wave as Bobby angled off for his own classroom, then raised it again. When he reluctantly put the pen in his pocket, the woman was down to her panties, and Lewis just knew if he kept twisting, she would turn around and he would get to see his first real look at a naked woman. He'd never seen anyone naked before, except for himself, of course. The anticipation gave him an uneasy feeling, not altogether pleasant, but he suspected he was powerless to resist. Lewis's brow furrowed, and he hastily swallowed his food. Dad, he said, what was Mom like? Frank Dahlgren paused, a forkful of microwave stroganoff inches from his mouth. He cleared his throat, lowered the fork, and smiled. Well, she was a lot like you, he said. She was smart and pretty. You would have liked her. He hesitated. Why the sudden curiosity about your mother? Lewis shrugged. I don't know, just curious. Bobby's mom makes him wash the dishes and do all kinds of stuff around the house. But she's real nice. Lewis lowered his eyes. He wanted to say more, but the words for what he felt weren't in his vocabulary. I understand, his dad said. You miss her. But how can you miss somebody you never even saw? Lewis was embarrassed to realize his eyes were dimming with tears. He didn't want to look like a sissy, not in front of his dad. It's okay, son, his dad said. I miss her too. He looked down at his plate, then began to eat slowly, methodically, the way he did everything. They watched television together after Lewis did his homework, and when Lewis caught himself dozing off for the third time, he heard his father clear his throat. He looked up from the floor guiltily. His dad smiled. I think Bobby would be better off dead. Lewis stopped in mid-yawn. What? I said, I think it's time for bed. Lewis stared at his father. I thought you said something else. His father rested a hand on Lewis's shoulder. Hearing things is a definite indication of bedtime. Lewis grinned, yawned again, and headed off for bed. Good night, Dad, he called over his shoulder. Good night, son. In bed, Lewis remembered the pen, and he retrieved it from his shirt pocket and got back under the covers. The room was too dark to see anything inside the pen, until Lewis had the idea to use the moon for light. He pointed the pen toward his window and looked through the other end. Inside, the woman was fully clothed again. He began twisting the pen slowly, stifling another yawn. The woman got down to her panties, and just as Lewis imagined, she turned to face him. Her tiny mouth, bloody red with the moon's wan light, moved in silence, as if she were saying something to him. Lewis strained to read her lips, but all he could make out was the word fuck. He kept screwing the pen's body this way and that, making her repeat the words, but nothing more revealed itself. He gave up and focused on the woman's body. A slight twist, and she obediently removed her last article of clothing. It was disappointing. She had hair down there, and, try as he might, he could not discern what might lie beneath. Secretly, he was glad. He yawned again. In the dream, the woman was full-sized and in the room with Lewis, and she spoke to him, and he could understand every word. She told him that she wanted him. For what? He had only the vaguest of notions, but her urgency frightened him. She came closer, reached out and unbuttoned his pants with practiced fingers. Before Lewis could protest, she had knelt and pulled his pants down to his ankles. He felt cold fingers wiggling under the waistband of his shorts, and then they too joined his pants. For a moment the woman froze, and Lewis forced himself to look down. The woman was glaring up at him. They stared at each other, Then she leaned her head back and began to laugh. Her breath was misty with alcohol, and Lewis wondered if her teeth didn't look a little rotten. "What am I supposed to do with that?" she asked him. She laughed again, shaking her head. "Just what am I supposed to do with that?" It was nearly 6 o'clock when Lewis got home from school. Lack of sleep had caught up with him in history class, and Mr. Finning had embarrassed him in front of the other kids by waking him up. "Dad?" Lewis called out, but the hollowness of his voice rebounding off the walls told him he was alone in the house. Dad worked 9 to 5, punctually, but Lewis was used to his father working late every once in a while. He tossed his books behind the sofa and dug under a cushion for the remote control. Lying back on the sofa, kicking off his shoes as an afterthought, he switched from one channel to the next. But all that was on MTV was some pukey girl with an acoustic guitar singing about wells and Greenpeace and stuff. HBO had some movie on made for kids, which meant it was boring and not to be endured longer than necessary. Lewis was about to turn the TV off when something on one of the channels caught his eye. He switched back to that channel, then shook his head. On the screen was the woman from the pen. She was kneeling in front of a boy about Lewis's age, even though the boy had his back to the camera. Lewis knew you didn't have to be Einstein to figure out who he was. Lewis got down on the floor in front of the TV and stared at the picture. Tentatively, he reached out and touched the screen, and a sudden electrical charge rushed out of the TV and up through his arm. The woman knelt before him and told him that she wanted him. She unbuttoned his pants and pulled them down to his ankles. He felt that same cold hand wiggling under the waistband of his shorts, and then they too joined his pants. This time, Lewis had the presence of mind to grab the woman's fingers just before it reached out for his crotch. The woman looked up at him in amused surprise. "Why are you doing this?" In the dream, Lewis's voice was diffused, hollow. The woman shook her head, then raised a finger to her thickly lipstick lips. "Shh," she hushed. "He'll hear you, and I've got something to tell you. Something important." For a moment, the woman's eyes grew fearful, and she cast a glance over her shoulder, as if checking for observers. Then she leaned in close to Lewis's crotch, making him step back in alarm. Her hands flew up and grabbed his buttocks, holding him in a firm grip. Her fingers were like ice. "What?" "Be quiet," she said in a scolding tone. "He might be listening in right now." She fixed Lewis with a solemn stare. "You've got to stop him. I'm not dead, and there are others to think of. You just have to—" "You must have had a hard day at the office," Dad was saying, his hand gently shaking Lewis's shoulder. He nodded at the TV, which stared back at them with a static-filled screen. "What were you watching? I hope you remembered to do your homework first." Lewis rubbed at his eyes with a sweat-dampened fist. He grinned sheepishly at his father, then said, "We didn't have any homework today, but I guess I did forget to do the dishes." "Honesty is always the best policy, boy," Dad said. "By the way, did you think about what I mentioned last night?" Lewis scratched his head. "What did you say last night?" "Too much TV," Dad said with a sigh. "I said that it might be better if Bobby were dead." I thought you said something else." Dad shook his head. "No, son, I always say what I mean." But why do you want to hurt Bobby?" "I don't want to do anything to him, Lewis. I want you to do it." But why?" "You'll understand when you're older, Lewis. But it needs doing. It really does. Frankly, I'm surprised you didn't realize that for yourself." I can't kill Bobby, Daddy. He's my best friend." "You always hurt the ones you love," Dad sang off key. I won't do it, Dad," Lewis said, trembling. This was all so crazy. Scowling, Dad reached out and grabbed Lewis's shoulder. "You must have had a hard day at the office," Dad was saying, his hand gently shaking Lewis's shoulder. He nodded at the TV, which stared back at them with the static-filled screen. What were you watching? I hope you remembered to do your homework first. Louis rubbed at his eyes with a sweat-dampened fist and goggled at his father. It had all been a dream, just a weird, scary dream. He grinned sheepishly and said, "We didn't have any homework today, but I guess I did forget to do the dishes." Dad shook his head in mock disapproval, and, after a moment's hesitation, Louis went in to take care of his chores. That night, Louis lay awake until 1:30, afraid that if he closed his eyes, he might meet that woman again. For the first time in his life, he was afraid of a dream. He pinched himself. He slapped himself. He shook his head until he felt queasy. But it came anyway, stealing like a stalking wolf into his drowsing, vulnerable mind. The woman looked up at him in amused surprise. Why are you doing this? The woman shook her head, then raised a finger to her smeared lipstick. Shh, she hushed. He'll hear you, and I've got something to tell you, something important. For a moment, the woman's eyes grew fearful, and she cast a glance over her shoulder, as if checking for observers. Then she leaned in close to Louis's crotch, making him step back in alarm. Her hands flew up and grabbed his buttocks, holding him in a firm grip. Her fingers were like ice. What? Be quiet, she said in a scolding tone. He might be listening in right now. She fixed Louis with a solemn stare. You've got to stop him. I'm not dead. Extra, extra, read all about it. Louis drew back. What? Extra, the woman pleaded. Read all about it. Her words were crazy, but her eyes held a sorrow too deep for Louis to fathom. Whatever it was the woman wanted him to do, it was a matter of life and death. But whose? Louis opened his mouth to speak, and the woman began to retreat, her arms out, beseeching, her eyes still pleading with him to what? To read all about it? Louis and Bobby stood in the corner of the playground watching the energetic warball game spread over the yard. Bobby took a shot from his inhaler and turned to Louis. Something's weird with my dad. Louis was thinking of the dream. In fact, he could think of little else, and Bobby's words were an insect's drone in his ear. Meaningless, insignificant. I think he's going crazy or something. Huh? Louis said, not really caring. In his mind, the woman knelt before him. But there was something wrong. Her lipstick was smeared broadly across her pale face, but it didn't really look like lipstick. It looked like something else. Louis wasn't sure he really wanted to remember what the red smear was. Just trying to made his groin ache with surprising ferocity. It made him want to double over and cry out. I don't want to do it, Bobby suddenly cried out, and the abject terror in his voice snapped Louis out of his reverie. Huh? What's the matter, man? My dad wants me to do something bad, Bobby sniffled. Yeah, like what? He told me to kill you. He what? Bobby nodded emphatically. Yeah, he was just talking to me like he does sometimes at night. And then, all of a sudden, his eyes sort of rolled up in his head like he was a zombie or something, and he says, real weird like, Louis is the real danger, Bobby. You're the only one who can stop it all. Louis remembered the strange words his own father had whispered, the ones he'd been certain he misheard. Did he say anything else? Louis asked. Bobby nodded, his face miserable. He told me all kinds of ways to do it, to kill you. Like if we were on the monkey bars, I should shove you off, or I should push you in front of a car. Stuff like that. Bobby crouched down and hugged his knees to his chest. He was sobbing openly now. I'm scared of my dad, Louis. I'm really scared. What about your mom? Huh? Is your mom saying weird stuff too? Louis asked. Bobby thought a moment. No, at least I don't think so. Wait. His eyes stared at some distant danger. She was cooking dinner yesterday, and when I walked in, she just looked at me kind of strange and said something about the girl being the last to know. Lewis leaned forward. Last to know what? Bobby shrugged, still hugging his knees. I don't know. Maybe I didn't hear her right. It sure didn't make any sense. Bobby, Lewis said suddenly, and his friend's face snapped up to stare at him. Yeah? Does your dad still have all those pins? I don't know. I think so. Why? There's something weird about those pins, and I think maybe they have something to do with what's going on with our parents. Our parents? Lewis sighed. Yeah, my dad's been saying weird stuff, too, but I thought I just didn't hear him right. Lewis told Bobby about the strange dreams he was having, and he repeated verbatim what his father had told him about Bobby. Bobby listened in silence, his tears drying on his cheeks. So what do you think it all means, Lewis? Lewis shook his head. I don't know. Maybe it doesn't mean anything, but I think maybe those pins your dad has are doing something to everybody. Have you been having weird dreams? Bobby wiped his nose against his sleeve and shook his head. Not like yours. Well, maybe everybody has a different, Lewis thought for a moment, trying to remember the right word. Reaction. Did your dad take his briefcase in today? Bobby shrugged. I don't know, probably. We should go over to your house right now and check. Bobby looked around. You mean skip school? Yeah, we gotta go now before your dad gets home. But why? Bobby stood up, brushing the gravel from the seat of his pants. I told you, we gotta check out the rest of those pins. Why? Geez, Bobby, don't you know any other word? Sure, but why, Lewis? Because, Lewis said, leading the way around to the back of the cafeteria where their bikes were parked. We have to find out who's inside them. That's weird. Yeah, I know, Lewis said, and knelt to his combination lock. In a brief moment, they were pedaling down Elm Street. Bobby's father had taken his briefcase, but they found an entire box of the pins in a corner of the garage. Bobby jammed his fist into the cardboard box. We don't have to check them all, do we? There must be thousands of them in here. He wiggled his fingers, and the pins made plastic clacking sounds like dried teeth rattling in a leather sack. Lewis shivered. Look through this one, Lewis said, grabbing one for himself. He held it to his eye and twisted. Inside, the same woman did an abbreviated version of her striptease show. He lowered the pin. Is it the same woman as before? Bobby nodded. Let's look at a couple more. They dug into the box, looking through the lens. Lewis saw the same woman. Same one in this one, Bobby said. Lewis sighed. I guess they're all like this. We should check out your dad's office, see how many more of these there are. Why? Because, Lewis said with a tired sigh. I think that maybe your dad's put something on these pins to give people nightmares. Maybe drugs or something. Bobby's mouth formed a tiny O. Oh, he said. Then he frowned. But my dad wouldn't do something like that. Isn't he the one with the briefcase full of the pins? Yeah, Bobby said miserably. But I bet he didn't do anything to them. Maybe somebody else did. That's probably it, Lewis agreed, his lips drawing into a thin, determined line. Still, we better make a plan. At the turn of the century, the Springwood Linen Works, then the Springwood Asylum for the Insane, had been the largest structure in the state, towering 16 medieval stories high and enclosing nearly 5 square football fields worth of space. Although it has since been dwarfed by the Eddy Building and the Smithy Suspension Bridge upstate, both of those structures were over 100 miles away in different directions. In any case, the Linen Works was still the largest building in town, and there was no perspective point at which you could not see some part of its broad, brick and glass sides, or at least one of the 7 huge wooden evaporator tanks on its roof. After checking the parking lot, there was a single battered Ford neither of them recognized parked in the distance. Lewis and Bobby ditched their bikes in a small elm grove and crept up to the rear of the Linen Works building. They studied the long row of frosted glass windows that ran the entire length of the building. Bobby looked at Lewis, who had picked up a fist-sized rock and seemed to be studying it for some hidden property. "You're not going to break a window, are you?" Lewis answered by heaving his rock through the nearest pane. The crash made both of them jump. "Geez, Louise," Bobby said, then followed Lewis over to the window. Lewis snaked an arm through the hole. There was an audible scratching sound, then a rusty click, and Lewis pushed the window in. It was hinged at the top, and he held it up. He looked at Bobby meaningfully. Bobby shook his head. "Not me, man. You first. You know, I heard this place used to be a loony bin." "What?" Bobby nodded. "Yeah, my dad was telling me this used to be an insane asylum up until about 20 or 30 years ago. Then it just sat here for a while until the Springwood Linen Company bought it." "So?" "So maybe there's ghosts of crazy people in there, you know? Maybe they're just waiting for some dumb kids like us to break in, and then they'll get us." He took a puff off his inhaler. Far off on the interstate, an 18-wheeler kicked on its jake brake, and the sudden grumble made both boys jump. They were suddenly very aware of how isolated they were, here on the outskirts of town, preparing to illegally enter an empty factory. "You still want to go in there?" Bobby asked, his eyes very wide. No, Lewis didn't, but he nodded. Bobby backed away from the window. "You first." "Then hold the window, dork." With Bobby holding the window open, Lewis slithered into the ground floor of the linen works. He held the window open for Bobby, and together they turned to survey the room that chance had selected for their entrance. It was a huge room, its flaking steel beam ceilings at least 3 stories above them, its length and breadth uncertain in the gloom. Around them stood row after row of mannequins, most of which were missing at least one important appendage. Here an arm or a leg missing, there an occasional headless body. Lewis let the window close slowly. The refracted light from outside made the shadows in the room jump and jitter, and for a moment the mannequins appeared to lean toward the 2 intruders. Both boys shivered, and Bobby actually put a hand on the broken window frame. "I'm getting out of here, man." "They're just dummies, dummy," Lewis said, and despite his fear, Bobby giggled shrilly. Flashlight held out as totem against some hidden evil, Lewis and Bobby crept down one long aisle after another, searching for an exit. After the 4th aisle revealed no egress, Lewis turned to Bobby. "We're doing this the wrong way. We should find a wall and follow it around. That way we'll find the door." Bobby nodded furiously. Lewis could see he was terrified. "And maybe you'd better let me have the flashlight." Bobby drew his flashlight back protectively. "No way, man." Lewis sighed. "Okay, you man the flashlight for a while then, but shine it in front of us so I don't trip over anything. Unless you want to go first." Bobby shook his head emphatically, though Lewis had known which position Bobby would take. "Okay, just don't go shining the flashlight all over the place or you'll start giving me the creeps too." Lewis decided not to mention that he was terrified as well. Bobby was only proceeding because he thought Lewis was fearless, and Lewis was proceeding only because, why? Why was he creeping through this deserted factory when he should be home doing his homework or watching TV with his dad? For a moment, Lewis actively considered the question, then shook his head imperceptibly. There was some mystery here that had to be solved. The factory held some horrible secret, a secret that Lewis knew involved him, though how he could not tell. "Let's go," he whispered. 100 yards later they found a wall and began following it around the room, searching for a door. 10 minutes later, Bobby emitted a high, thin squeal. Lewis stopped and turned to his friend. "What's the matter?" "Something's in here with us, Lewis." The flashlight's beam stuttered over the solid bodies of mannequins surrounding them. Bobby was shaking so hard his teeth were beginning to clack together. He sucked on his inhaler. "Don't you hear it?" "That's crazy," Lewis started to say, and then he did hear it. A faraway scraping sound like something wounded, dragging its useless limb across the dirty concrete floor. It sounded both huge and hungry. A Frankenstein's monster seeking revenge after a bloody run-in with the local peasants. "I'm getting out of here now," Bobby said. He turned and ran back down an aisle toward the almost invisible glow of dust through the broken window. Lewis was suddenly thrust into complete darkness. "Bobby?" No answer, save the sound of that wounded foot dragging against concrete. It sounded closer now, in the darkness, and Lewis bit off a second call to Bobby. Whatever was making that sound, he knew it would zero in on his voice. He suspected that it didn't need light to aid in its hunt. Suddenly, Bobby screamed. There was the distant clatter of the flashlight striking the floor, and then nothing. Not even the foot dragger. Was it listening for another scream? Or had it been the reason behind the scream? Had it caught Bobby? Lewis began to walk down the aisle, one arm thrust out before him, the other trailing a hand across the invisible faces of the mannequins. He found himself turning left, then right again. Something was wrong. All the aisles had been straight. They'd run the full length of the room, so why were they now turning into a maze? And why had Bobby screamed? Lewis stopped, his left hand resting against the surprisingly warm face of an unseen mannequin. He decided to chance it. "Bobby!" he cried out. Suddenly the mannequin began to squirm against his hand. It screamed once abruptly. There was a flash of light, then Lewis's head exploded with pain, and he felt himself dropping to the floor, cracking his head against the cool concrete. He fell through the darkness, into darkness. Lewis awoke with the start. All around him was black, though there seemed to be certain nearby shadows cut from a darker cloth in the darkness, and they moved. Lewis's head throbbed from the double blows, and he cradled his face in his dirty hands, feeling each particle of grit against his skin, like a tiny drill bit moving against linoleum. Around him he could hear a multitude of whispers, all impossible to understand, though there seemed to be an air of urgency to them all, as if terrified people were organizing an escape from a library. That image struck Lewis as funny, and he barked out a brief laugh that sounded immense in the gloom. The whispers abruptly ceased, and in the silence Lewis was able to discern a soft, susurrant sound, like someone trying to breathe through a goose-down pillow. The source of the sound was off to his left, and Lewis crawled toward it, not caring if the sound came from the foot dragger or from some other even more dangerous monster. His hand touched it first. He felt warm flesh and cloth beneath his fingers, and the suddenness of the sensation brought an involuntary gasp from his lips. The thing spoke. "Lewis, is that you? Bobby? Lewis?" The two boys clutched at each other like shipwreck survivors clutch at a broken spar. The air was full of their shared sighs of misery and relief. "I thought something got you," Lewis said. "I thought you were dead," Bobby responded, and Lewis felt his breath, feather-light, brush against his cheek. "Where's the flashlight?" Bobby grew silent. "Where's the flashlight, Bobby?" I dropped it." "You what?" "I said I dropped it, okay?" "Oh, Bobby, how are we going to find our way out of here without it?" For a moment, Bobby was quiet, and then, "Can't we just follow the wall like before? We'd have to come to the window eventually." "I don't think so," Lewis said. "I thought all the aisles were straight, but when you ran off and I tried to follow you, every aisle I turned down only went a little ways before I had to turn. It's like a maze, this room." "So how are we going to get out?" Bobby's voice was shrill, almost crying. It hurt Lewis's ears. "I guess we'll have to try the wall trick. Maybe I just got confused." Lewis stood up, fighting against the throbbing pain that threatened to rip the top of his head off. He rubbed the back of his neck and then the large knot forming on his left temple. "You really hit me good." Lewis paused, remembering something. "Wait a minute. Wasn't it the flashlight you hit me with?" No. "It wasn't? Then what was it?" "I think it was a mannequin's arm." "So you'd already lost the flashlight when you hit me?" "I'm sorry, Lewis. I didn't mean to hit you." There was something following me, and I was so scared. Bobby was beginning to blubber now. I didn't know it was you. You. Lewis reached out in the darkness and patted Bobby's shoulder. It's okay. I would have probably done the same thing. Really? Yeah, except I would have hit you more than once. Huh? Lewis smiled in the darkness. I'm just kidding, you dork. Oh, come on, let's go. Lewis took a step, then paused. He reached back toward Bobby. Come on, take my hand, you dope. Bobby's hand was cool and damp, and it closed like a vice around Lewis's fingers. Geez Louise, Lewis said. Not so hard. Sorry. Together they began moving through the darkness. Lewis kept his free hand before him, waving in the gloom like an insect's antenna. His fingers brushed against the dusty faces of the mannequins, but he was beyond caring. He just wanted out of this place. Suddenly, Lewis was jerked back, and it took him a moment to realize that Bobby had stopped. What's the matter with... Shh, Bobby said. Can you hear it? Lewis held his breath, and yes, he could hear it. That same scraping sound, and it was coming down the aisle toward them. It sounded no more than 10 feet away. Oh, Jesus, Lewis said, and then abruptly there was light. It was a very dim light, but to the boy's eyes it was as if someone had turned on the sun. Lewis blinked his eyes rapidly, lending a strobe effect to the scene before him. Mannequins lay at all angles on the floor, a jumble of body parts that bled. The blood had coalesced into a pool that Lewis could see engulfed their shoes. Lewis raised his eyes and saw, standing atop the heap of bleeding mannequins, a man. A man whose face looked remotely familiar. Though Lewis could not get a fix on it, it seemed to be constantly unsatisfied with its features and kept changing them in rapid movements. The nose grew large and bulbous, then thin, aquiline. It seemed to settle on Romanesque. The eyes were blue, then brown, then green. The hair under the fedora went from blonde to black to gray. The appearance it finally decided upon was as foreign as any Lewis had ever seen. Still, there was something about it. I thought I told you he'd be better off dead, the face said. Both boys spoke together. What? They looked at each other in terrified surprise. Guess I'll have to take care of your business, the man said, as he stepped off the pile of bodies. A lone eyeball made a soft popping sound under his boot. When he lifted it, there was a thick, translucent spot on the floor that reminded Lewis oddly of snot. He felt the gorge rise in his throat. The man raised a hand that Lewis thought for a moment had unusually long fingers, which he saw too late was really a glove with razored fingers. Lewis had enough time to gasp, and then the man was past him. Lewis whirled on his feet just in time to see the razor sink into Bobby's belly. With a snort of pleasure, the man jerked his hand up, and Bobby's intestines slid out of his body to droop onto his sneakers. Bobby's mouth formed a small O, and his eyes made small, concerned movements. The murderer jerked his hand back, and Bobby dropped to his knees, making a squishy sound as they crushed his own internal organs. With one last pleading look at Lewis, Bobby toppled over, face down in his own viscera and blood, which was already mixing with the blood from the mannequins. Wait a minute. Mannequins don't... With an abrupt start, Lewis was jerked awake. Bobby was tugging at his arm like a mad dog on a short tether. Come on, Lewis! He was screaming. We gotta get out of here! Lewis's head whirled in confusion and pain. What? Come on! He's gonna get us, man! Who's gonna? The guy, man! The guy with the fingers! Come on! With an abrupt clarity, Lewis understood what Bobby was saying, and he struggled to his feet. You dreamt it too? I didn't dream squat, man. I saw him. He's a couple of aisles over right now, man. Let's go! Lewis let himself be led, running down one aisle after another, their only light the bobbing globe of the flashlight beam. You found the flashlight. I thought you lost it. Bobby's word came between gasps as he ran. Lost it? Didn't lose it. What do you think I hit you with? You said it was an arm. Bobby didn't respond. Apparently his need for oxygen was greater than his need to argue. Lewis allowed himself to be pulled along, And then suddenly they rounded a corner and there was the window. For a moment they simply stared at it. Two pagans confronted with the physical manifestation of their god, and then they were scrambling through it, both cutting themselves on broken glass as they did so. The night air was cool, and the stars were tiny pinpoints of apathy above them as they ran for the bikes in the elm grove. As they each began to mount their bikes, a burst of maniacal laughter froze them where they stood, and then they were pedaling madly, as if the very devil himself were aiding in their escape. Okay, guys, this has been the first half of the short story Briefcase Full of Blues from the anthology book Freddy's Back, The Nightmares on Elm Street, Freddy Krueger's 7 Sweetest Dreams. This is actually the third short story that I've done from this book. This one's a bit longer than the other two, that's why I'm splitting it into 2 uploads. But I'm not going to make you wait like I have in between each short story for the second half of this one. I'll be putting it out tomorrow. So tomorrow you will get the conclusion to Briefcase Full of Blues. What I've been doing with this book is every now and then I just throw out one of the short stories as a surprise upload, as I've done today. And I'll continue to do that until all 7 of these short stories have been added to the channel. And once that happens, I will make a full playlist for the book and an unabridged version of the book with the short stories all in one solid individual upload of the entire anthology book. But guys, let me know in the comments section what you thought of this story so far. You know, for a short story, it feels like it could be a novel, at least like a 200-pager. The characters are being fleshed out decently for a short story. I feel like there could be a lot more backstory there if it was in a bigger book. But I'm enjoying it so far. I'm curious who the woman is that's saying that she's not dead. I'm curious if Bobby really saw Freddy while he was awake. Are we looking at a Nightmare on Elm Street 2 type scenario there? Because Lewis saw him in the dream, but Bobby said he wasn't asleep when he saw him. Or, since they were hearing the laughter when they were driving off, or riding off on their bicycles, are they still dreaming? Is one of them still dreaming at the moment? I guess we'll find out tomorrow, guys, whenever I come back with the conclusion, the second half of Briefcase Full of Blues. Till next time, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying thanks for listening, and pleasant dreams!